think we're all here, so I'm going to just quickly do a roll call. I'm Laura Sutherland, Division Administrator at DAGCAP, the Division of Trade and Consumer Protection. I think many of us were in a group together already, so nice to see everyone again. If you could, when I call your name, just briefly give your title so the folks that you haven't talked with before can your face and what you bring to this discussion. Just remind everybody who you are. So first, Karen Bauer.
Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Bauer. I'm a legal aid lawyer, and my practice includes both consumer protection and student loan law.
Great. Jody Chung.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jody. I was a legal assistant in La Crosse after finishing my undergrad, but now I'm moving to Madison to start my first year in law school there. And just as a student loan borrower myself and just many experiences that I've had and the research that I've done, I'm hoping to make some type of contribution.
Great. Lucy Fenzel.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm the Interim Dean of Letters and Sciences at the College of Menominee Nation. I'm also the Green Bay Campus Site Coordinator and Biology faculty there.
Fantastic. Renee Gash. Renee, you're on mute, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name.
No, you got it right. I'm Renee Gash. I live in De Pere, Wisconsin, up here in Brown County near Green Bay. And I'm a student loan borrower myself. Still working on paying off those student loans. So thanks.
Larry Graves. Larry, you're on mute.
Mute. I am unmuted. Larry Graves. I am with I'm an education consultant with the state approving agency. We're a small group under Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs.
Super. Austin Hammond.
Hi everyone, my name is Austin Hammond. Political science student at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, and I serve in student government on the executive board, and I'm also a student loan borrower.
Marisha Harris.
Hi everyone, Marisha Harris. I serve as the lead community relations analyst for Goodwill Industries of Southeastern Wisconsin and Metropolitan Chicago. And I am a student loan borrower. I finance both my undergrad and my graduate degree with student loans. Happy to be here.
Great. Kevin McShane.
My name is Kevin McShane. I'm the Vice President of Financial Aid and Compliance at Herzing University. I also am currently the past president of WASFA, which is the Wisconsin Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. And I've been in financial aid for about 20 years. And I'm also currently still in the process of repaying my student loans, so have some, personal information on that side as well.
Senator Jeff Smith.
Yeah, I'm Jeff Smith. I have around the Eau Claire area, so I represent the 31st Senate District, which includes Eau Claire over to Mississippi down the Blackbird area. So I have two daughters who have also experienced student debt, so we're very much, as a family, interested in this subject as well. Thank you, everybody.
Brandon Trujillo.
Hello, my name is Brandon Trujillo. I'm a policy advisor with the Wisconsin Technical College System, and I've worked on financial aid issues for the system office. I was actually doing a presentation this morning to our board requesting them to approve an increase in Wisconsin grants for technical college students that we're going to be submitting to the Higher Education Aids Board. So we're working on trying to get more money for students today. So thank you.
Great. And lastly, Casey Wapniak.
Hello again. I think we've all heard a bit of my background, so I won't rehash that today, but I will say, I'm excited to be here and be able to contribute some of my insights about the for-profit schools in this more interactive forum.
Perfect. So welcome. That's everyone to the Consumer Protection Work Group. We are going to be hosted today by by Jess, who is being super useful and running this whole communications of this organization, or this task force rather. We have a scribe, Sophie Blumenstein. She's going to be taking copious notes, and you'll see them in the chat function here. So if somebody says something and you don't recall what they said, she will have written it down, which is amazing. We also have a couple of subject matter experts here. So if we have questions or can't remember something, they'll be here to help us. Nick Hellman, he presented to us at the first meeting, associate professor at the UW's Madison School of Education, and he's the director of the STAR Lab. Professor Hellman, thanks for being here again. And Kim Dancy, a doctoral student in the Department of Education Leadership and Policy Analysis. She's a graduate assistant at the STAR Lab and works with Professor Hellman. So thanks you all for being here. So we have a little bit more than an hour to talk today and a lot to talk about. Does anybody have any questions about anything that Secretary Blumenfeld talked about in terms of the process or where we're going from here? So I'm gonna since we don't have a lot of time, I'm not gonna regurgitate that entire process, but essentially today and next meeting, we're gonna tackle the project, the ideas and solutions that were put in the consumer protection bucket. We'll ideally do half today and half of the next meeting, and prioritize that for this group, 2 to 3 solutions that we want to present to the full group in meeting 7. Some of the issues we've already had a presentation on, and fortunately, some of those presenters are in our group. So if we have follow-up questions, we have some subject matter experts with us. Some of those presentations haven't been made yet, and we'll obviously try to save those for our next discussion. And we should be getting some more white papers or one-pagers on the sub proposals that we haven't heard about yet. So looking at some of the proposals, does everybody have the list of proposals for our group in front of them? And if so, I think what I'd like to do, since we do have an hour to talk about them, is there any that, some that obviously we've already talked about, addressing racial and economic inequality, inequity in student debt, that was discussed in a couple meetings, T3 meeting 2. Advocacy at the federal level was discussed at meeting 3. Data collection and sharing was discussed at meeting 1 by Professor Hellman, and he's also provided additional solution summary in your packet. Those first 4 we could talk about today. Foster children and financial support, we have not gotten any information on that, so I say we table that till next week. We've heard a fair amount about Ombudsman and student loan advocate, as well as student borrower bill of rights. In the previous meeting, we could talk about that. Today, we talked a great deal about the regulation and for-profit colleges and institutions, so we can open that up to the group. As well as private loan protections. We've heard a little bit about that, and oversight of servicing in meeting 3. So the ones that we've already talked about, there is one more in here, partner with legal aid lawyers to assist low-income borrowers. I understand Karen Bauer is going to be providing some more information on that. We haven't gotten that yet, so I suggest we table that to 6. So the ones that we've already sort of dug into, is there anyone that anyone in the group would like to start off with and talk about as a possible solution?
It seems to me, this is Karen Bauer, it seems to me that the Student Loan Ombudsman's office solution is something that, in my mind, has kind of floated to the top as far as all of these proposals that we've heard about thus far have been concerned. So I'd like to chat through that one.
Sounds good. Does anybody have a question about what that that solution is, and do you have any questions? Does anyone need that framed up for them?
I know we've talked about that in the past, but it would be helpful for me to have an overview of that solution to help reinforce the context.
So Karen, I'll take a stab at that, but fill in if anybody else has any other information on this. So the ombudsman is in part sort of part of the Student Loan Bill of Rights. You often see them partnered, and that was in the presentation by the Illinois Attorneys General that talked about the BBOR and the ombudsman. And it's essentially a center point for any state to field questions, concerns, advocate for student loan borrowers, as well as highlight any concerns they might be having. So in other words, if you have a centralized office, not only field questions and provide solid information to student loan borrowers, which is kind of a serial problem that we see, getting accurate data about how to pay your loans back, what you're eligible for. Also, the ombudsman can highlight when there are issues that are coming up and try to get in front of them, either through education and maybe through an enforcement mechanism if there are some serial problems with law violations. That's how I view it. Karen, do you have any other insight into what that office would look like?
No, I think that you pretty much covered it. And the part that I was especially interested in is the fact that Wisconsin has already tried this kind of in another context. During the mortgage foreclosure crisis, there was an individual who was kind of served that function right at the in the Consumer Protection Division of the State Attorney General's office, where she was able to help. It was an attorney who was there to help people navigate through their mortgage modification options. And I thought that office was a great resource for the state, which is why I thought that the Ombudsman's office could do the same for our student loan borrowers.
Thank you for the context. I do have one question before we go into the conversation. Is there a data tracking and analysis component to the work that an ombudsman would do?
I certainly think there could be. I think Illinois, I don't know, Professor Holman, I don't know if you recall if any of the ombudsmen around the country have a data tracking component to it. I believe Illinois did from their presentation. It certainly could have. I mean, particularly if they could easily track complaints and that kind of thing. And to Karen's point, there was a tracking component to the mortgage foreclosure team at DOJ. It dealt more. It was more with tracking complaints and particular servicers where they were coming out of. You could generate a report on that, but obviously data could be aggregated on any form.
So I'd like to ask, or maybe get clarification on ombudsman. I agree that really caught my attention right away early on in our meetings. That is really important, but it seems to me that that's still a defensive mechanism rather than being on the front end of the process. And I think that we need to be sure, unless the ombudsman does cover that, I don't think so. That's the clarification I need on consulting or helping people navigate the system at the front end of the loan process.
If I may share just an observation, if you want to think about some maybe other areas of public service that might be applicable here, nursing home ombudsmen come to mind. They, like what Senator Smith just referenced, they're more proactive. They can do rounds, go check in on nursing homes, for example, or in this case, go check in on colleges or check in on X, Y, or Z more proactively. That's also a model that might be useful.
I recall in one of the presentations that proactive education was part of the role of the ombudsman to actually assist high schools in preparing students with financial literacy information. So I think that would be a key component of an ombudsman office, is to make sure that the training and materials are available to those who are supporting students in the FAFSA process at the outset.
And I do agree with what Laura said, that usually the ombudsman's office is paired with a borrower bill of rights, which would cover some of the things that were mentioned as far as being proactive as well.
Well, and I was hoping that we would be able to merge the two of them together and have it be just one piece, because I think they would go hand in hand. That student loan borrower bill of rights, if that was introduced, I think it would be all one comprehensive package that we could all put in there. So they could be combined together, because I think having an ombudsman and a student loan advocate is very important.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that's a really good idea to have the two join together, because it seems to have some parallels that like they can coincide, as well as like a financial literacy program to like have it on the forefront to be proactive early on. Student loan borrowers, that the state has their back, and that commitment from the state to protect them and teach them along the way through the process.
Yeah, and more specifically, I'd love to see this ombudsman oversee a FAFSA completion goals set for high schools to really increase the amount of FAFSAs that Wisconsin students are submitting. And I know in one of the presentations, some states had required it as part of graduation rate. I'm not sure if that is the best route, or if it's more of an unofficial goal setting by the ombudsman that helps to increase the numbers more informally rather than a formal graduation requirement.
I think that might be part of the other work group that's labeled borrower education and management of higher ed expenses.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation, Karen. And one other thing I would say about marrying the front end and the back end in the ombudsman, the borrower bill of rights is really structurally, there's some model legislation out there, and it's structurally designed to deal with people who have already incurred debt. And that isn't to say that the ombudsman's office or the student loan advocate couldn't have information about the front end, but it's really more geared towards current borrowers and then repayment. And as somebody who's, anyone chime in on this, but in working in this space, when you try to merge both ends of that paradigm into one office, it can kind of, while I think they need to work in symmetry, it can really bog down that office, right? Like, because in other words, their spectrum is so enormous, and then you have to think about the resources to meet the needs of both the front end and the back end. So just something that for me that I think about when I think about the borrower bill of rights, it is, to Senator Smith's point, more of I wouldn't call it defensive, because it can be proactive in terms of protecting people. It can be educational about protections and understanding your repayment and following violations and trying to head them off at the pass, but it's not preventative in terms of how much debt you take out. It's more targeted at borrowers.
So then if we were to have some sort of advocating agency, I guess my question would be then, would we create a whole nother entity as well? Because I don't know. I think, I don't know why the ombudsman couldn't do both.
So I'm with you, Brandon, in the concept of, I think we're on the same track, but so should the office have, or I should say, should the Bill of Rights be written so that it supports two offices? Because I kind of get what Lara's saying too. Is that I have to look at it from a perspective of what am I going to present as legislation that becomes statutory. So would it be one Bill of Rights, but it supports two offices or two positions?
Well, and I wonder how much of this could be covered by the Higher Education AIDS Board, perhaps, since they're already dealing with the FAFSA itself. Do I have that correct?
They would need a lot of resources. They're already they're struggling as it is, and so if we were to tack anything onto the Higher Education AIDS Board, they would need additional manpower, and there's no doubt in my mind, and they do have access to that information, and they work with the FAFSA and they work with the federal government on those. So yes, you are correct on that.
But in following on what Karen's saying, it does seem like if there's an infrastructure there that obviously needs to be supported and get more resources, it makes more sense in my mind to build the financial literacy piece, that front end infrastructure in a place that's already in existence. Whereas the Borrower Bill of Rights, typically the Ombudsman are put in a regulatory, like, so in Wisconsin, it would be the Attorney General's office, or it would be DADCAP, where we already have an infrastructure to deal with fielding complaints and so, those two infrastructures already exist, and you would implant this additional regulatory framework in one or the other. And I do think, again, to Karen's point, that Borrower Education Management, Higher Education Group, they are looking at FAFSA completion, financial literacy, and affordability awareness. So those issues that they're looking at where that should go. So we can certainly talk about marrying the two concepts, but anyway.
Laura, if you don't mind, I would chime in on this discussion about offices and where to place things, and just point out that we're operating within a unique situation here in Wisconsin as it is. We do not have a Department of Higher Education. We don't have one post-secondary coordinating body. Instead, we've got this bifurcated structure where, we've got the for-profits that are overseen by the EAP. So we already, we're dealing with a piecemeal sort of system, and I worry if we create a new office and a new entity, we're just adding to the complexity of things. That said, when we talk about placement of these functions, it would have to be something that's supported by adequate infrastructure, and within some entity that has knowledge of the whole base. So we talk about HEAB. Most of the students who are attending our EAP schools do not have any interaction with HEAB or the state grants. So that would be a piece to look at. So just throw that out there as something we want to consider as we delve in.
Great point. Does anyone want to talk about the substance of the Borrower Bill of Rights? Or does anybody have any concerns about a Borrower Bill of Rights? I'm hearing a lot of sort of advocacy for that. Are there reservations that anyone in the group might have about it?
I think as long as it is something that applies to all institutions, to all, it's a protection for all borrowers, rather than taking an approach where we sort of cherry pick and specifically focus on for-profit institutions and borrowers. I think that it's an easier lift to tackle all ends of the spectrum, but certainly an important one from my point of view.
I guess my question would be, if we had a borrower bill of rights, who, and not an ombudsman, who would oversee the enforcement of that bill of rights?
I don't think there are any states that have a Bill of Rights without an ombudsman's office.
But are we talking about the ombudsman office then being in DADCAP? Is that what you're thinking, Casey? Or, I mean, you're still looking at an ombudsman.
Yeah, I mean, the most logical options would be DADCAP or Department of Justice, you know, who has some interaction with the enforcement issues. You welcome other suggestions, but I think without creating something new, those would be the two most likely fits. I suppose Department of Financial Institutions could be something worth considering since we're all here.
I'll just speak from a borrower's perspective. I think having the clarity of a title of a student loan advocate or student loan ombudsman would go a long way into helping students be able to find the right person to help advocate for them. It's such an incredibly confusing maze of nonprofits and organizations you don't know you can trust, and to have there be a very clear advocate, I think it is in the best interest of students who are facing student loan debt.
I agree completely.
So,
And
go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think just going along with what everyone is saying and what Casey's saying and Senator Smith, it's just, I think that maybe having the two offices at least under one organization to where they're able to still work collaboratively would be pretty good. And I would almost also make a suggestion to where if we do have some student loan borrowers bill of rights, that could be one maybe legislative package that we would be endorsing, and then any of the other subsequent item. I'm looking at my list of all of our items that we have, the 12 different items. I'm just wondering if we say, you know, we all back the loan borrower's bill of rights, and then we say we should add all of these categories underneath that and have it as one legislative package. And I don't know, Senator Smith, what would you think about that as being the one who has to advocate for legislation?
Yeah, that works, Brand. It can work, I should say. You know, I think there are other people on here who probably understand how their department takes on a package like that, and then what we do beyond actually passing legislation, of course, is creating rules, and some of that can go into that creation of the rules as well. So you don't have to put it all into the original bill, but it can be implied, and then it comes back around, and it's a process. It's you know, as they say, making sausage, but we should certainly want to imply that all of those issues are addressed in a Bill of Rights. I think that is the right way to go.
So as a state worker, I really appreciate the conversation about how and the what are so integral to one another, and that we're starting with where we put it as opposed to what it would do. But I want to circle back quickly on the what it would do, because it sort of feeds into what people were talking about. Many of the borrower bill of rights have a licensing standard, so they license the loan servicers, right? Which would, probably in our state would be more aptly placed, or could be more aptly placed with DFI. You know, DADCAP does have licensing, but when we're talking about loan servicers, that seems like a place that would be more aptly placed with DFI. And they then set standards for servicing. There's often a data reporting component to it, which Professor Oman would be very excited about, and probably could give us some insight on what kind of data reporting would be useful. And then again, the ombudsman would be established within that office. And I do think Casey's comment is the challenge in our state is we have the Department of Financial Institutions that would oversee the servicing. We have PIAB, we have the EAP, and then we have DADCAP, that is a consumer protection, and they all sort of have different roles. So it is a challenge to figure out who wears, and then of course DOJ that does the enforcement. So one comment I would have is that there is an enormous state office building that holds DFI, and Casey's walking out his office. I don't know where PIAB is actually. I don't know where they're physically located.
I believe it's in our same building, the Hill Farms building. Mm-hmm.
So you could imagine, at least physically,
yes,
an entity that could exist and be intertwined with those other three entities as well, just from a physical standpoint.
I don't want to weigh in too much because I just feel like I'm learning a lot. But when I think of an ombudsman, I think of them sort of in the life cycle of the student after they borrowed the loan. So they're sort of first point of contact with this credit market. An ombudsman, I feel like, should have a role in that very first day. But it sounds like maybe a lot of the conversation is focusing on long after they're in repayment. And so sort of like, to what extent would the ombudsman also be advocating for borrowers' rights when they're enrolled in college, not just after? So I'm just curious, thinking about sort of data collection, but also any sort of enforcement. I'm just curious if that, plays into the mix here.
Yeah, and I would agree with Nick. I think that's one of the concerns that I have, is that a lot of issues that borrowers have along the way is not just somebody with wrongdoing on the back end or complete misunderstanding on the front end. There are times when it's really about the student understanding, how do I get into the right repayment plan? How do I understand how compound interest works? How do I, that there's so much that happens in between there that isn't often covered, that I think we have to make sure we're considering as part of the process.
And one of the big debates right now, I appreciate that, Kevin. One of the big debates that I keep hearing about is about sort of servicers steering borrowers into certain repayment plans or away from certain repayment plans. And there's no real way to get at that without having the borrower's transactional records, their actual month-to-month transactional records that you can only get by, I think, really having a student come to the ombudsman and say, hey, I think I've been done wrong, or having the ombudsman proactively going out and saying, hey, these are points along the life cycle that seem to be problematic. And I think that those are two very different approaches. My sense is that given resource constraints and sort of to some extent, ambiguous goals, the ombudsman might, look very different depending on how you sort of, prioritize those different points in the life cycle. I'm not sure if that helps, but I'm just thinking through this and listening as best I can, trying to see if I can help at all. Sure.
And I just wanted to touch on, as someone who talks to student loan borrowers all the time, the importance of meeting people where they are, right? And by its very nature, consumer protection tends to be dealing with people only once they're in trouble, right? No one's going to call, I'd like to call them an advocate, because the word ombudsman is weird, but people only seek out that advocate when they have a problem. People who don't know that they have a problem are never going to access any of these state agencies. So part of that meeting people where they're at is, I'm wondering if whether or not, as part of the Borrower Bill of Rights, we could provide some level of funding to the educational institutions themselves for additional financial counseling, financial aid counseling at the time people are borrowing the money.
So you suggest, yeah. So Karen, I kind of like that idea. So that each campus, the state would provide funding a position at each campus that is, and then they work. That position works with this new created Office of Bill of Rights.
I think most campuses already have financial aid counselors, but I think potentially providing enough, a little funding bump so that they could either have an additional person or just have more hours put in to providing that counseling to people. There is entrance and exit counseling for student loan borrowers, but in my opinion, it is mostly ineffective. And part of the reason for that, based simply on consumer behavior, is that once the student has actually entered school, we know that nobody is going to say, oh God, I didn't know I was borrowing $30,000. I'm leaving, right? That doesn't happen. But some level of education at the point that they're borrowing, I think, is important.
Karen, I think you're right in that. I think for the issue with institutions, financial aid departments, I know we have one financial aid officer right now for our entire institution, and that person may or may not have the right training. And I think that's where the funding sometimes can come in to train that person ahead of time as they're counseling those students.
And if I can weigh in, just having a number of years working in a financial aid office under my belt, I think you guys are absolutely right. That part of it is about resources, part of it is about training and understanding. But back to the main point of consumer behavior, there's a big part of this that is really about how do you get that consumer to do the outreach or to understand the situation they're in. And certainly some of that happens through basic education, but part of it is an understanding of the resources that are available to me. And I think that's where a lot of times we come up short is if you had a state office where people knew, hey, I know that they have my best interest at hand. I know that this is somewhere I can go and it's widely publicized as something that's available to people, they would know. If each university or college is running it slightly differently and has slightly different resources available, again, it could water down the impact of what we're talking about versus potentially having something where everybody knows the state of Wisconsin's invested in this and this is how we're handling it. So I don't know if there's a perfect answer or a perfect recommendation I have, but that would be some of my concerns if it was managed by each individual institution.
I think the observations about consumer behavior are so apt. And at the student loan, at the Wisconsin Coalition on Student Debt, I think we've spent our 4 years talking about not what the right information is, but how to get it to people at the right time. I mean, it's just confounding. And there's so many experts that think about this constantly. When we talk about the Ombudsman, the student standards for servicing would have baked in them requirements about how they explain to the student borrower at the time that they are enrolling, that they meet these certain standards of clarity and fiduciary duty and what have you when they explain it to the borrower. And so, I think that talking about knowledge base for the consumer is super important. But when it comes to consumer protection, we also have to think about regulating the folks that are offering this, right? They're the ones with the most information, and Karen is correct that people don't come to consumer protection until they know something is wrong, which is why education has to be, the consumer must be aware, but we also really have to set up standards for those who are putting people in the repayment plans, right? That's where the sort of the rubber hits the road in my mind in terms of consumer protection around loan servicers. When we talk about financial information at the financial aid offices, I'm just curious to hear from the group about whether or not that's a good place to talk about repayment plans. Like typically, once you've left the school, you're not going to your financial aid office about repayment. And I would be surprised if anybody would think to do that, right? So having those two things separated, I don't see as an issue necessarily, but I'd be curious to hear from more seasoned folks in this field.
I'm just going to add a couple things here. A lot of this conversation reminds me so much of the conversations around credit card companies coming onto campus for the first week and trying to get kids signed up to their credit cards, but giving them out T-shirts and stuff. And it was successful, and kids would come back. I was on financial institutions in the assembly, and I am again in the Senate, and we'd have these hearings. Kids would come in and say, we didn't know we had to pay it back. It was just a card. And I feel like that's the same thing that happens to them in their understanding of student loans in some ways. And in today's world and in this generation, we should be developing, and maybe it should be part of this whole Bill of Rights, is that each student is provided an app that they have to have on their phone that tracks their loan from day one all the way through, and they can continue to keep checking on it. And it even sends them warnings like banks will do that you have gone overdrawn or you have done something you shouldn't have done, or did you know you were at this point? So those are the sorts of details we might want to think about as we move along too.
I do think we need to refocus our discussion a little bit because there is a borrower education subgroup, and by its nature, consumer protection is not, unfortunately, going to be the group to tackle that. I don't think. I think it's too much to ask because people are not. Just by its very nature, the consumer protection piece is going to involve people at the repayment stage, not at the borrowing stage, I don't think. The same way that DACCAP and provides, some consumer education on its website, but its main duty is to deal with problems.
I'd like to offer just a brief example, and I think Kevin, I'd really be curious if this is right, but in North Carolina, about half of the community colleges in the state no longer allow students to even borrow federal loans. Oh, sorry, if you can hear me okay. In North Carolina, a lot of community colleges have decided to not even participate in the federal loan program, and so students, when they're enrolled, before they ever enter repayment, while they're enrolled in college, can't even take out federal loans because their colleges aren't participating in the federal loan programs, and so they go to the private loan market. That sounds like a consumer protection issue that happens while students are enrolled. But Kevin, I think you might have better insights on sort of how colleges opt in or out of the federal loan programs and the consequences on borrowers.
Yeah, and that becomes a pretty complex issue, and I appreciate Karen giving some of that context around. It gets a little muddy on what's borrower or consumer information and protect, on the front end, and then what becomes overall protection and what do you do along the way. The problem with the federal student loan program right now, or what can be deemed a problem, is that you're either in or out, and if you're in, you can't limit how much money students borrow if you're an institution. So you could have a community college, again, with a significantly low tuition rate. A student could receive a Pell Grant or any other form of grant aid that covers all of their direct costs, and there's nothing that stops them from borrowing the maximum loan amount available to them up to their cost of attendance. So these students, in theory, could take on massive amounts of debt throughout the process with the school having no control over that. So how some of these institutions have elected to have some control over is to say, we just won't participate at all. And if a student wants to come here, they have to understand that that's part of the deal that they're part of. Is you understand by coming here, you're not going to do that. And some students opt to go to a different institution. Some understand that and live with that. Some go to private debt, which again, a lot of times, unfortunately, the private debt option is very rarely as beneficial as had they been eligible for the federal loan option. So so it does become pretty complicated and how you can navigate that without some changes to the federal rules around controlled borrowing, where the consumer is not the one in control, but it's more, either an institution or someone to notify them. And I think that's part of this overarching discussion, again, when you get into, repayment, or are schools advising students accurately in that process? How does that work? We also have to remember when we talk about disproportionate impact and different people are impacted based on a number of factors. Like at my institution right now, we do a personal meeting with every single incoming student. That includes a financial literacy component. And we have a team of 5 people on the back end that will help you navigate your student loan repayment. I can't tell you how many students still don't understand because it's so complicated, or they're connecting with our back end team far too late in their process when they're already in trouble, to Karen's point earlier. So there's kind of these dots that even when you're providing that education, you're assuming whatever effort you're putting in is changing that person's full understanding of the issue. And I think that's complex, right? So I agree in the Borrower Bill of Rights, have some rules, make people play by the rules, but I think there has to be some context of widely publicized support or continued information that I'm able to access to help me in the process that I just want to make sure we're not missing as part of this because of some of those complexities.
Can I use that actually to segue us into some other conversations? Because A, we have 30 minutes left, and B, I think you started talking about, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but one of the third item on our list is advocating on the federal level. And also you talked about some issues of racial and economic disparity in student debt. So we, as I see it from these 12, we really dug in somewhat on the borrower bill of rights, the ombudsman, and then also the oversight, reporting, and servicing of loans would be, I think, arguably built into the BBOR. We can come back to these things, obviously, but I'm wondering, with Kevin's insight, do we want, and we talked a little bit about data collection, can we move into some of these other conversations about advocacy at the federal level, disparity, racial and economic disparity, or any other topic on this that you guys want to talk about?
Yeah, I'd love to raise 3 regulations that I recall hearing in the presentations that I think would address this topic. There was a requirement that servicers put students into, or recommend an IBR payment plan before putting students into deferment. I think that could be an option based on some of the borrower feedback. A second one is the right to sue. So students could sue for-profit institutions if they have been scammed out of their education. And then the third is, this might be on the federal level, but I'm wondering if there's a state solution as well. And that's the easing the IBR renewal requirements so that those who have to renew their IBRs every year have a little bit more grace around getting that those income statements in. And perhaps if there was more of an automated system where the IRS is sharing data with the student loan servicers so that that process is more automatic for students, for borrowers.
Yeah, I think those are really good points, and I think one of the things that I struggle with a bit in here is I have a bit of expertise in federal advocacy. It's something I spent a lot of time on and work with a lot of financial aid professionals on. One of the complexities I think of our challenge in this process is how do we do things that supplement what's happening at the federal level, not that completely contradict it, or you're working on a solution that then they override. So there are things in place like the data sharing between the IRS and the and ultimately the Department of Education that's kind of in play right now that they're struggling with how to implement. There is also, if people didn't see the announcement, about a week and a half ago, the Department of Education announced that they currently have 9 major loan servicers. They're going down to 5, and it means completely getting rid of some of the services that are out there and getting people onto a standard platform. So anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there's a lot of things happening at that level that I think it is important that what we craft protects students of Wisconsin, but at the same time that there is this, where do you put energy instead of crafting a different rule that maybe makes it more complex for borrowers, where you actually put some effort into federal advocacy and fixing some of the core issues that are underlying that are controlled at the federal government level.
Nick, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the idea of easing the IDR payment. Do you have any thoughts about that and whether or not that's a federal advocacy position or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's smart to advocate for simplifying income-driven repayment plans, finding ways to help students or borrowers, find the right plans for them. All that makes good sense. I think, though, I mean, the big picture, the more that we advocate for income-driven repayment, the more we're advocating for individuals paying for college themselves through loans. Just make lending easier, make that privatization process the norm. And so I think that that's sort of a risk that's on my mind when thinking about making income-based repayment simpler because it's really fascinating. And I'd be happy to share some of this. In the 1950s, before the federal loan system as we know it was created, income-based repayment was sort of like the ideal model that they wished to have had so that there wouldn't have to be public subsidies in higher education. Just have students borrow what they need, pay for what they consume, and then base it off of a percentage of their income in the future. And that was Milton Friedman's grand idea on how to pay for college. And so here we are, 60 years later, advocating for that original idea. And I think that there's good sense, and I think there's good reason to do that. And I think for the short term, absolutely. But I do think some bigger thinking about how to pay for college and sort of how to advocate at the federal level, if we're worried about loans, how to not have to borrow in the first place. So expanding the Pell Grant program, investing in minority serving institutions, investing in broad access colleges so that students don't have to borrow. And I think that gets lost sometimes when we focus just on improving income-driven repayment. So kind of a little bit of both, but I'd say yes, absolutely advocate for it, but also, keep the lens wide.
So wondering if we could talk a little bit about racial and economic inequity and student debt, thinking about Lucy Fenzel's presentation today in shining a light on that issue, particularly with tribal communities, but also in communities of color. Does anyone have any thoughts on ideas about resolving the racial and economic inequality and student debt burdens?
One of the things that I heard during the previous presentations was about how when basically it's a race to complete the FAFSA, and that the first people that do have a better chance of getting grants, and that necessarily is much more likely to negatively affect first generation college students, which we know based on what Casey was saying earlier, right, are going to be Native American people, are going to be Black and Brown people in general, because we know that they so far have had lower educational attainment. And I wonder about fixing that issue so that they have just as much of a chance of even getting loans or grants compared to everyone else.
Well, and I think it all comes back to both trying to get assistance to people on the front end and on the back end as well. And I just believe that, I mean, I've heard stories from students, especially those of color, who have been recruited by, some of our nonprofit institutions. They've gone to public institutions and they've gotten themselves into debt, and they just didn't know what they were getting themselves into. And I just think that I think we want to focus on not only the consumer protection on the back end, but we have to focus on the front end as well. And also look for additional assistance for students as well to help them get through school with very little debt. They're reliant on debt financing.
Yeah, I have to say that, and Karen, all due respect, but I do think the front end is still consumer protection, because we have to consider ourselves protecting people from misinformation in the front end or being just placed in the wrong place at the front end. So I think that's important, but also to your question here about this racial disparity and being first generation education. That makes a lot of sense to me. So, like for instance, the CARES Act, one of the things we dealt with was people thought that the small business loans or the farm loans were only going to be distributed first come, first serve, and and that was not true. They were all going to be bunched in up to a deadline, and then distributed according to need after that. And so, is that what you're thinking, Karen, when you talk about changing that, thinking about first come, first serve?
I thought I had understood in the previous presentations, it was either in the first or second meeting even, that when it came to getting grants, that the people that applied by a certain deadline could be potentially getting the grants, and that if you missed that deadline, there was literally no hope. But maybe I'm recalling that incorrectly.
Karen,
I can weigh in on that if that's helpful. That is true for certain funds. So where from the federal level, where schools have campus-based funds, which would be your SEOG grants, college work study, or federal work study program, things like that. But from the state level, that's also how the state grant program works. So and now with prior year on your taxes, you can fill out the FAFSA as early as October the prior year to go to school in August or September. So again, if you're someone who's aware of the process and understands that many of those students are applying early, if you're a senior in high school and you will be a first generation student, how many of those students know that they should be applying almost up to a year prior to have priority in some of these funded programs? So I think that's absolutely it's factual, and it is a bit of a concern. I think, obviously the devil would be in details in how do you fairly and equitably disperse the money available, because there has to be some deadline or timeline in which you review the applications and push that forward. So you'd have to decide what that looks like.
I think this is a great example of there is overlap between our subgroups, right? So the other, I see Karen nodding her head. It's really true. So consumer protection definitely covers all of these things, but at the same time, we need to be wary that the education group is going to be probably covering that as well. Hopefully, we'll hear back from them on that, right?
Well, and if I could go back to, I think Kevin, you were talking about this discussion, and you were talking about having some work that was done on the front end, and you're. I think when it gets to the institution, that it might get watered down a little bit if we were to provide resources for our institutions to be providing some of this advocacy work and education for our students. And I was just wondering if maybe we would have this consumer protection go through wherever the agency is that we identify, and say DADCAP, and some of the funding comes through there, and they provide a certain amount of funding to the institutions, and they create a curriculum for student financial aid advisors and how they would be providing some of this counseling that they could be doing. And it would be done on a formula level. So if there's a certain number of students in each of the institutions, they're going to get this amount of money, and they're going to be able to provide this, and it's all going to be coordinated by one agency. So sorry to go back, but I never got a chance to provide any response to that.
I think one need that was identified too was better data on where grants are going to. Right now, there's no demographic data collected on who is receiving grants, and I'd love to know how that shakes out on racial, gender, family income level wise, and if that is something that could be collected through the FAFSA, or if it needs to be collected in a different way through, high school counselors. That could be a solution, or, oftentimes zip code can be proxies for other demographic information. And if we can look at how our grants are being distributed by zip codes, so we can understand if the most low income zip codes are getting the majority of the grants, that would be helpful information. And I'm also concerned about those students who do not complete their degree yet have debt. And I think those are disproportionately students of color. And I'd love to think of some solutions of how we could provide relief to students who graduated with debt but no degree.
I think also we need to, excuse me, I think we do need to also be aware of when we're thinking about allocating funding based on maybe like Brandon mentioned, the number of students. We have to be specific about which, we've got a disproportionate amount of students that are part-time. And as somebody mentioned in the chat earlier in our main meeting, that the CARES Act funding was divided based on FTEs, which then really was an issue with our MSIs.
I agree with that, and that's a very good point. And I was just kind of just throwing it out there as a model. And to that point, we could say each institution is going to get this amount flat funding, but it should probably be based on head count, not FTE, because those students are enrolled in programs, they're borrowing money, they're getting financial aid, they're getting all of those things. And so, for discussionary purposes, we could come up with that formula, I think, if that would be of interest.
I wanted to share briefly an example that might connect to the advocacy conversation. Earlier, Renee mentioned some data quality issues, and there are so many. But you mentioned zip codes as sort of a proxy for race. Because of the way that we are segregated, racially segregated, zip codes can work pretty well for that, unfortunately. And so Senator Cory Booker requested the New York Federal Reserve Bank to do an analysis of some of the most segregated metropolitan areas in the U.S. and look at student loan debt in those areas, Milwaukee being one of them. And so that could be a way to kind of keep this conversation going. So at least there's one example out there of how federal advocacy has resulted in getting some better data on these issues.
Well, and I think that if we're looking to get better data, especially out of the Higher Education Aids Board, to look at some of those grants and identify who's getting them and successes and demographics, I think if we get additional resources to HEAB, they might be able to start doing some of that work.
I would do next. Happening here. I certainly believe that we need the data infrastructure because it's hard to solve a problem that you don't clearly understand, right? I would add, though, analysis. We need to understand from a data perspective consumer behavior. So when we're looking at marginalized communities, borrowing, I think Kevin talked about earlier, more costs. I think we need to get a deeper understanding of complex lives that people are living in marginalized communities and how that is driving consumer behavior and the debt burden. And intergenerational poverty too. Generational wealth is a privilege that many communities don't have. And so I've had conversations with individuals who support their students, their children in different ways that you don't typically see in communities of color. So for example, I was talking with a white coworker of mine, and she talked about how she supported her children so that they didn't have to take out as much student debt. And so she talked about paying their rent. She talked about paying their car notes, their cell phones. So while she was limited in certain aspects of paying tuition, she provided support that is not always typical in communities of color, and that allowed her students to take out far lower amounts of student debt to get through college.
Marisha, to your point, and I think I'm going to put Kevin on the spot because I'd be curious, and you were talking about the students are allowed to borrow money, and even if it's beyond what their need might be. And is how do you know how we would be able to? I would hate to say we need to put a cap to try and control that, but what kind of safeguards could we put into place to help from people, you know, putting themselves into such debt that it's really going to hurt them? I don't know how to better add it to say that, but I mean, it's almost I've seen it before myself. So
yeah, and it's really a complex question because the answer is how do you go about doing that? How do you determine what each individual person actually needs to be able to achieve their education? Because what you have to be careful of is if you completely say nobody can get any money, then what you start to do is actually limit access. And that's a real problem, especially when you say that you're trying to, you know, fix kind of what I would call long range socioeconomical and racial issues in this country. If you start to limit access, you're compounding the problem, not intentionally, but it's sometimes unintentionally, saying, "Hey, I'm trying to solve this problem, but now subsequently I've created this other problem." It's also one of the challenges that I see too when we look at data. So people look at student loan debt data in aggregate, right? 1.6 trillion, and everybody, you know, average is 31,000. Well, we're not breaking out how much of that is used for direct tuition and fees, how much of that is used for, supplementing cost of attendance, living along the way, how much of that is a result of things like compounding interest that disproportionately affects first generation students that don't know to pay interest while you're in school. Or what about, the fact that although there's fixed interest rate every year that you're in school, so while you're making consumer decisions on the front end, they're changing all the way through. So I think that's it. You know, again, it's really complicated. I hate to give that answer that it's complicated and messy, but it really is, because you have to find a balance between limiting debt but still providing enough funding that people can truly access the education that they need.
I'm going to echo that too, Kevin, in that I was just talking with someone yesterday who is now divorced, but her previous husband had taken out, was helping her with her student loans, and had actually taken out more than she needed for that semester. And he was using it then when she got that money, he was using that money. And now she has built up this incredible amount of debt that she didn't know he had taken out. So I'm wondering if there's some way that we can figure out ways to cap those types of things where, you know, so that they know that they're taking out this much extra beyond what their tuition or their books or other things.
And again, I think that's that debate between educating them to make the proper decision, or do you take some more drastic measure to try to do it from a regulatory perspective? And again, I think the challenge is what happens when you have a low income student who's in a very intense nursing program where they're taking nursing clinicals. They don't always have the opportunity to have another job, so they may need money to help them with rent. Where again, maybe another student, oh, my mom supplements my rent or something like that. You know, so you got to be careful that you're, is it truly limiting these egregious situations we hear about, or do you start to have, other students impacted that maybe you wouldn't like to see impacted?
Since we only have 3 minutes left, can we take a little bit of time to talk about how big of a lift politically and financially some of the proposed solutions would be? I especially would be curious to hear from our elected official who is in this group about how much support there is in the Wisconsin legislature to deal with student loan issues.
Well, Karen, I'd like to think there's a lot of interest in this because that's the rhetoric we hear. I can't say that that always means it's real. You know, we're all living in a real world here of politics right now. The pressure is going to have to come beyond, because, by the way, while we were here in this, somebody interrupted me and I told him what I was doing. He said, "Oh, those task forces, they do nothing anyway." And I have to say that sometimes, I think that's mostly the impression. So we're going to have to really put a lot of pressure on the fact that this is an important issue. And we're going to have to ask those who have made presentations, including students, especially that younger generation, to put on a tremendous amount of pressure on politicians to take seriously the Bill of Rights that we're going to present at some point, and whatever else comes out of this.
So I'm going to jump in here because we do only have 2 minutes left. And thanks for that, Karen. I was thinking we would get to that maybe next week after we had sort of gotten to the meat of some of these issues. And by my count, there are 12, right, that we can talk about. We covered today in part a discussion of racial and economic inequality or inequity in student debt. I think that touches on a lot of our ideas. So that will probably be an underlying theme that we'll continue to talk about. We've talked some about advocacy on the federal level, data collection, ombudsman, oversight, and student loan borrowers. We still have Bill of Rights. We still have some discussion to talk about predatory schools and the regulation of for-profit colleges, and also the legal aid awareness. I think we can tackle those next week. If folks can go back and revisit the worksheet that we have for proposed solutions, to be thinking about some of these ideas for our homework next week, and we can revisit it and talk about it. I know we didn't get to talk a whole lot about the light heavy lift for getting some of this through, but we can take a stab at it by ourselves and then revisit that conversation next week, or I'm sorry, at the next meeting. And the other thing I would encourage folks to look at, the topics tell us which meetings each one of them were discussed in. And I would encourage you to go back and look at some of these presentations and refresh your memory. There's some great considerations and recommendations with respect to the issues of race, inequity, and student loan debt from our second session. In the last slide, some questions we should be asking when we think about whatever solutions we come up with. And with that, it's 1 o'clock. I really appreciate everyone's contribution. It was a really fun and lively conversation. If anybody has any questions, I can try to answer them. Otherwise, Michelle Reinen obviously put in the slide deck. If you have a question on substance, you can email that to the task force. And if you have a question on process, you can email that to Michelle Reinen. Both of those emails are there. If you have any questions about our homework, you can find that you can email them there as well. If anybody has any questions right now, I'm happy to answer.
Just one quick question. Will the notes in the chat be sent to us via email?
I don't know if I have the answer. So send the notes and stuff out.
I'm sorry. Will the notes chat be sent via email to our group?
Yeah, I heard the question. I was mute, so
Okay, I'm sorry.
She may not be listening. I don't know. My guess is yes. So I'll go with yes, and if not, I'm just thinking. Sophie, do you know?
Okay.
Sorry, I couldn't hear. I am like pasting them all into a document, and so I think it will be sent, but I'm not positive.
Yeah, we'll send them to you. Good question. Anything else?
Great group.
That's it. Thanks, everybody. Nice talking with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everybody.
Thank you.